Hi, and welcome to this beginning introduction here to a study of Paul's epistle or his letter to a group of Jesus followers in Rome. We call that the letter to the Romans. And I'm exploring it as a guide to spiritual formation. I'm Gary Mintchell. I'll be your teacher, leader, guide. I should mention right off the bat, I am not a theologian. I stopped short of getting more letters after my name years ago, and I am just somebody who eschewed going out after more letters and degrees and certifications and just pursued knowledge, and eventually knowledge kind of gave way to more than kind of that. You need the knowledge as a background, but it's more than that. And we'll explore that in this look at the book of Romans. Now, Paul wrote this letter to a group of Jesus followers in Rome who'd heard the story of the resurrection of Jesus and a new way of life that this brought to people. And the word had spread throughout the Mediterranean area, and he heard of these people through constant travels of messengers who tied all the groups together. I sort of try to remind people that back then people traveled as much or more than today. They got around, you heard about what was going on all over the place. And so Paul thought he needed to express some thoughts to these people. So I take a thought, it's kind of one of the backgrounds of this study. I come from Thomas Merton, a spiritual writer that I greatly admire. And he mentioned this in one of his books. For Christianity is not merely a doctrine or a system of beliefs. It's Christ living in us and uniting people to one another in his own life and unity. In my decades, actually, of teaching from the Bible, I've noticed a certain wariness of people toward reading this letter to Rome, the Christians in Rome. It seems to scare them because it's people say, teachers say, theologians say, preachers say that this is actually a really deep theological book, and you need like a PhD or a THD or one of those Ds after your name, something where you've studied your entire life to be able to try to understand the theology behind Romans. But I kept thinking that doesn't really jibe with my studies and my teaching and responses I've gotten back from people about this whole thing. Yeah, I'm sure there's like way too many theologians have written way too many books probing the nuances of every Greek word that Paul wrote. They tried to uncover Paul's deep theology about many things. I've read a couple or more of those books where they say, well, so-and-so says that this Greek word kind of means this in English, but really it could mean this, and they argue that. And I wanted to get beyond that. Like I said, I'm not a theologian. I've discovered I've read too much in that field, actually. I was thinking I hadn't read much, and then I discovered, oh my goodness, I have. But I found that we should probably take people for what they say. Trying to dig into words for hidden meanings is a fool's errand. I once read, probably when I was taking a poetry writing class years ago, that don't ever ask a poet what he means or she means by the poem they wrote. Read the poem. And don't go digging around. You can dig too much. So I decided to step back and take a look at this letter to the Romans. And as I'm reading, it came to me that if you read the document straight through several times, I did this years ago. Okay, let's just settle in and read the stupid letter. I mean, for goodness sakes, that's how it was meant when Paul initially wrote it. He would write these epistles to gatherings all over the Mediterranean, and it would go to somebody who could read Greek, which, by the way, was not easy. It's just a string of letters, and when you read it, you have to figure out where the word is and where the sentence ends and where the paragraph ends and so on. It's not easy. I started to study Koine Greek, as they say, and gave up. I thought I'll just leave that to the experts, and I'll read it in English, which is what I can read. So anyway, that's how they were done. They wrote it out, somebody could read it, and they would read it to the gathering, and then they would discuss it. And that's probably how it went. So somebody knew how to read, somebody knew how to write, and they could get that, and the people would gather together, and they would read this. And I thought, let's just read it straight through, and then I would outline it. And what I started in my studies otherwise was that this letter actually tells us a story of a journey into life with Jesus. This document leads us through many examples into not only how to change our lives, but how to live once our life is transformed. It's a logical, step-by-step guide to our journey of spiritual formation. It takes us from living a life apart from God to living in the Spirit. Now, we have to put this in context. So along the way, Paul he dealt with problems that the early church had that we really don't have today. Let's just say we don't have the identical problem, but we have maybe similar problems. I'm referring to his and to us asides about the differences between Jew and Gentile. This was important to Paul, a Jew whose ministry, assigned by Jesus, was to bring non-Jewish people into the way, as the movement was called at the time. After all, the Way began as a Jewish cult spreading rapidly throughout the different cultures and races of the Mediterranean world. Paul needed to bring everyone together into one unified movement, and he mostly succeeded. I mean, it's humans. They're not going to necessarily all come together, but he did a pretty good job of that. So, go back. Following Jesus is a personally transformative experience. The ecclesia should be a place where spiritually transformed people meet and by their examples, not necessarily words, bring others along into the journey of transformed lives. As we read Paul's words, I think it's okay, in fact, I think it's almost mandatory, to question and argue with Paul. He is, of course, right, but he was also a creation of his culture and time, and he had been a Pharisee, and Pharisees loved to argue. So I think he would appreciate it if we would argue back with him. I think that's fine. I don't think there's anything sacrilegious to reading his words and maybe asking questions, which of course we cannot get answers to because Paul is long ago passed away. But we could ask questions like, would he have written the same thing about homosexuality today, knowing what we know about genes and heredity and that sort of thing, rather than his blend of Jewish desert philosophy and the way homosexuality played out in certain Greek cities? A lot different than a lot of it today. Paul, about the time he was writing this, was on trial in Caesarea Philippi and appealed, and he kind of lost, or maybe he was afraid he would lose. I don't know. But he appealed to take his case to Rome. Claudius was the emperor at the time, and he was focused on the law and often served as a judge. This was a situation when Paul wrote the letter. So they said, okay, take your case, because Paul was a Roman citizen, so he could appeal to the emperor, which he did. So he traveled to Rome. Well, along the way, because you couldn't just like me, go down to, pick up a ticket and take a plane and be there in a few hours. It took him some time. Well, while he was traveling to Rome, Claudius was killed, probably by his wife, and his stepson Nero became emperor. You may have heard of Nero. He was crazy, and he burned a big chunk of Rome, and he blamed it on the Christians. Oops. Paul's now appealing to Nero. Would Paul have written part of chapter 13 about government if he had written it a year later, and Nero was the emperor rather than Claudius? Who knows? We don't know, but it's worth asking. And there were more likely other things we could consider. But what if questioning takes us off the track? So let's step back, and I outlined the letter, and basically looked at it this way. There are basics in this guide which really fit spiritual formation or spiritual development or whatever you want to call that, or just growth, a transformed life. And first is awareness of our sinful life, and then we come to faith, and then we experience the grace of God. So, God's grace visits us. That's chapter 8 now, and then the next several chapters are living in grace. It's like, what's next? Be careful. Some Christians actually teach stopping at grace. Now, it's not unusual. Martin Luther was reading this letter to Romans, and he read the section on grace. Now, he had an agenda. His agenda was he didn't like what was going on in Rome. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he didn't like what was happening. So this kind of fit his theology, and he basically wrote stuff that started the Protestant Reformation. John Wesley read Luther's introduction to his work, and made a comment that my heart felt strangely warmed. Grace is important, but grace isn't the end of the story. We're not supposed to just sit there basking in grace. We are supposed to keep on living. So the last big chunk of this letter is, how do we live in grace? So this is a 10-part series, and we just finished the first part. And I'm going to just read short introductions to each section. I'll break it down into basically nine-part outline, and we'll just take a brief look at each one. We're not going to do theology. If you're doing this in a class, maybe you want to talk a little bit about it. I led a class in this, and it seemed to go very well, and a lot of people had their eyes opened of how to read the Bible without getting all worried about not being a theologian. And let's just try to get what Paul was trying to set forward as he gave us a path, a journey from living in sin or a sinful state or a state away from God to how do we live once we accept God's grace and live in grace. And that's the story we're going to tell. And I'll do 9 more sections, and we'll just take a look at each section. And I would encourage you, one, to read the entire letter. Just read it through. It's fairly short, and maybe read it every time we come back and meet again, and then then maybe go back and read it a couple of times. There's a lot here, and I think it's very valuable. And I think the most valuable thing is how do we live in grace. So thank you for coming along. You can make comments. You can send me notes, and I'm Gary Mintchell at hey.com, H-E-Y, hey, like hey you. So you can always send a note to me or send something else, fine. Don't bother trying to argue philosophy because I'm not up to that. So thank you. May you have a blessed day, and let us keep learning.